Now, in this next session, we will be exploring climate change and that other thing that everybody is talking about, AI. With the adoption of AI booming, companies are trying to understand climate and other impacts associated with its use. And this couldn't be more timely. In fact, just the other day, someone told me about a Wi-Fi enabled AI-powered dishwasher. I'm unsure if that sector is preoccupied by climate impacts, but you never know. Now, are all of the impacts of AI negative? Can we use AI to advance climate action? And how do we ensure that this is done in a responsible and wise manner? To help answer that question, we've got Google's Antonia Gawel in conversation with Bob Burgoyne from the Carbon Trust, and they will both get to the heart of the matter. Now, before we welcome our guests, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the first poll of today. We're going to put it on the right-hand side of the screen now, so please join in and let us know what you think. AI and climate, where do you currently stand? Is it a game changer for sustainability? Is it more opportunity than risk? Is it more risk than opportunity? Or are you a bit like me and you're a bit unsure and you're still making your mind up? Well, maybe this next session will help answer your questions and formulate your thoughts. So on to our guests. Antonia is Google's Global Director of Sustainability, Advocacy and Partnerships, driving company-wide climate goals with a focus on climate and AI, net zero and product solutions. With 20 years of experience in system change, she's held leadership roles at the World Economic Forum, the International Energy Agency, and World Business Council for Sustainable Development. She holds a master's degree from LSE and a BA from the University of Toronto. And Bob is an associate director in the Carbon Trust ICT practice with a particular focus on the data center industry. Very timely. Bob has worked directly with data centers in developing decarbonisation strategies to align with those important climate targets, and with places seeking to deliver net positive, both socially and for the environment, outcomes from data center developments. At present, Bob is leading work with a group of media companies evaluating the climate impact of generative AI. So please join me in welcoming Antonia and Bob. Over to the two of you.
Thanks very much, Tim, and great to be here. We've got, I think, about 20 minutes for this conversation, so I'm gonna kick us straight off. Antonia, there's a lot of attention, I think it's fair to say, at the moment on the environmental impacts of AI, but I think also perhaps not a huge amount of clarity. So maybe if you can just help set the scene for us. What do we mean when we talk about AI in this conversation? What are those impacts? And then how Google is thinking about addressing that challenge.
Super. Well, first, it's such a pleasure to be here and to be having this conversation. I'm really intrigued by the poll results. I see them in front of me, where we see indeed kind of most people who are still making up their minds. So maybe this conversation will help, but also actually quite a lot, 31% who do believe that AI can be a game changer for sustainability. And I would say this is really what our work at Google entails. On one hand, ensuring that as we scale AI, we do so responsibly. I'll talk a little bit about that, but also that actually there's incredible opportunity that we're seeing for how AI can enable climate and environmental outcomes. So I think, Bob, to answer your question, the first thing that I do, you heard from Tim, my background is as an economist and as an analyst. I always look to the numbers and I look to the data just to kind of ground ourselves. So maybe starting there, when we look at data center electricity consumption, electricity is really kind of the area that we're focused on. It represents about 1.5% of global electricity consumption today, right? So that's now. In specific locations, though, it's good to be aware that where there is a high concentration of data centers, there is a higher volume of electricity consumption on those local grids, right? So it can, in certain areas, be up to 20 to 30%. Now, energy consumption is growing as AI expands, right? Energy is a little bit the engine of AI. And some analysis by the IEA has outlined that by about 2030, we should expect to see about a doubling of electricity demand, which will put AI data center electricity consumption at about 3% of total electricity demand. So just to recap, today, 1.5%, 2030, we think we'll be at about 3% globally. What does that translate to in terms of emissions then? Again, projections from the IEA suggest that by 2035, in terms of emissions, they anticipate that data center emissions should represent about 2% of global electricity sector emissions. So I'm just putting the data out there so people can kind of contextualize and understand what we're looking at when it comes to both energy consumption, electricity consumption, and the emissions of the sector, right? So it is on the rise. It is still at this point a relatively small proportion of the overall energy demand and emissions from overall electricity as well. So then you ask yourselves, okay, what is Google as a company doing about this? How do we manage the responsible growth and development of AI? The good news is that for our latest data from 2024, we are already continue to see a decoupling. So data center emissions for us fell by 12% in 2024, while the energy consumption grew by 27%. So electricity consumption is growing up. We're managing to decouple those emissions for data centers. And how are we doing that? Really by taking a holistic approach, and I'm just going to simplify it to three things. One is energy inputs, right? So as I said, electricity is the major source that is powering data centers. So the electricity that you're bringing in, the goal is to drive 24/7 carbon-free electricity, right? So if we can bring carbon-free electricity into our data centers, then that's really how we decouple from emissions. And for Google, we have achieved an average of 66% in 2024 CFE across all of our operations in data centers. But of course, again, that varies by region. In about 9 regions, we've hit 80%. In other regions, it's less because it's harder to decarbonize those grids. So the focus here is on the electricity supply that matters. Then you take yourself into the actual data center, right? So imagine the data center that is actually housing the technology and the operations. That is the thing that is really driving the work as well. This really is about how efficient and how good is your infrastructure, right? So there's a specialized technology called tensor processing units, TPUs, that Google develops to run AI, and the efficiency of that technology really matters. And so what we've seen is in our 7th generation, it's now 30 times more power efficient than the 1st generation back in 2018. So you have to keep driving efficiency in that infrastructure and in the running of the data centers. The third dimension is now imagine you're kind of getting to actually the software that is creating the answers to the questions that you're asking, the models, right? So how efficient are your models? How are you designing your models to provide that information as efficiently as possible? The good news there too is you can make these models more efficient. And similarly, we're seeing incredible progress in terms of the efficiency, both in terms of the energy efficiency, but also the carbon efficiency and water efficiency of those models. Last year, Google put out the first of a kind industry paper to publish information about the median energy, water, and emissions from Gemini text prompt. And in that, we developed a methodology for how you actually go about calculating this, but equally showed that we have seen 33 times more energy efficiency, 44 times more carbon efficiency in 1 year in those prompts. So you're seeing incredible progress. So just to recap, it's about the energy that you're putting in, it's about the infrastructure that you're actually using, and then it's about the models and the efficiency of the models that is serving kind of the information that you're requesting from an AI perspective. All of these things have an impact on how energy and emissions efficient your AI becomes. And so this is really how we think about this holistic approach and really are trying to drive industry leadership in this space. So hopefully, Bob, that answers your question. I know that was a lot of information, but shall I pop it over to you?
Yeah, no, thanks, Antonia. No, that's really interesting. I guess maybe just zooming out a little bit, trying to think about what are the implications and the opportunities associated with the kind of the growth of AI. And there's probably a couple sort of system level things that I think are interesting that are kind of happening at the moment. So you've talked a lot about the increased power demand of AI, and that represents both a risk and an opportunity. I think the risk is that, we see some actors who are kind of in the rush to get power and in the rush to kind of build the next foundation model. They're kind of building, gas turbines. They're potentially extending the life of, fossil generation capacity. So that's not great. That's a dynamic which is happening. But the other thing that's happening at the same time is we're continuing to see the cost of renewables declining. We're seeing battery storage technologies, generation on generation really improving hugely. And so I think that power demands that you referenced at the start has the potential to really accelerate the adoption of renewables. And that needs some kind of policy incentives and other incentives, and the extent to which that will be possible varies by region. Clearly in the US, it's not politically conducive at the moment to that kind of thing. But what I would say is that I think the economics will win. Economics trumps politics, and we're seeing encouraging signs of the data center sector really kind of leaning into these renewable opportunities at the moment, with some offshore wind developments being sort of underwritten by some power demand from closely located data centers. So I think there's a lot of kind of interesting potential at this point in time. I think the other opportunity is kind of attached to that scrutiny that the sector is really seeing now. So, people who are using all of these AI tools have a kind of nagging sense at the back of their minds. What is the impact of this? Should I really be using these kinds of tools? And that's one of the things that's coming through. I think Tim mentioned we're doing some work at the moment with a group of media companies looking at the climate impact of generative AI specifically for video. That white paper comes out in a couple of weeks, so can't give the game away too much. But just to sort of talk on some of the headline things that are coming through from that, we're seeing that on the one hand, yes, the growth of this technology is potentially sort of driving up emissions on the one hand. There's the whole Jevons paradox thing, right? When something becomes cheaper to do, people do more of it. So, people who are now able to build amusing cat videos much more easily than they were able to before. And so we're seeing that driving some growth in emissions. But on the other hand, the technology has huge potential also to reduce emissions compared to sort of legacy technologies as well. And so, that's also coming through from the research that we've done. And outside of the generative space, there's, I think, a huge amount of really interesting applications that are kind of coming to market soon as well. We actually had an event this morning at Carbon Trust Towers with the Clean AI initiative. They referenced an investment figure of, I think, $100 billion coming into the clean AI sector over the next few years. So lots of applications that are have the potential for kind of game-changing efficiency improvements and therefore emissions reductions. An example would be there's Emerald AI, for example, which is a technology that's being trialed in the UK at the moment. And again, looking at the data center industry, it's a technology that allows kind of load shifting between data centers to enable them to provide a sort of reduced demand at points in time when the grid would benefit from that without compromising performance. So that's one example of an application, but you're really close to these kind of things as well. I'm sure you've got lots of other examples. Over to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think those are some great examples, and indeed, maybe specifically on demand management, this is certainly something that Google has been pioneering for a number of years. So just as you were explaining, on grids, well, data centers have to operate kind of on that 24/7 approach, right? In terms of continuing to run the operations. Power grids, indeed, at certain points in time, like hit a peak demand. And so the question is, how do you partner with the utilities to make sure that we can help mitigate that peak demand such that there's a challenge in the system? And so Google has pioneered and developed solutions where we can not only load shift, right? So there's a load shift in time and geography. So how do you shift your load when you don't need to be running particular workloads at a particular point in time or at a particular location, either to help mitigate a peak in the grid or actually to optimize for carbon-free power on other grids, right? So you can also decide to say, look, I want to go run my workload on this other grid because actually there's more carbon-free power on that grid at this point in time, which will equally help you reduce your emissions. So that's like one exciting area that we're certainly working on and continue to partner with utilities and other stakeholders to drive in terms of the supporting infrastructure of the power system at large. Another example that I thought I would share here is like in another sector, right? We talked a lot about energy, we talk about electricity when we talk about data centers and AI, but aviation actually. So the aviation industry, as many of you know, is an important industry when it comes to climate. And one of the really interesting things that Google Research and Google DeepMind have been doing is looking at how do you reduce the creation of contrails. So contrails are those white lines that you see in the sky. Pretty much anywhere in the world you look up, you see a contrail somewhere. Those are actually contributing to the warming effect from the aviation sector, right? So about 35% of the aviation sector's total warming impact comes from contrails. It also turns out that avoiding the creation of contrails is possible, right? So by actually understanding what's happening in the sky and how you can adjust your altitude at particular points in time, you can avoid the creation of those contrails, thereby mitigating that global warming impact. And so this is where research in partnership with Breakthrough Energy and American Airlines actually developed an AI-powered tool to be able to signal to pilots how they might adjust their flight patterns very slightly, which is actually something that they do all the time to avoid the creation of contrails and thereby minimize that global warming impact from the sector. And in the initial trials that were done, they resulted in about a 54% decrease in the creation of contrails. That was on a 70 flight test. They then did a bigger test with 2,400 flights, and there they achieved a 62% reduction in contrails. So if you actually start to translate, the use of these tools to help pilots kind of slightly change their behavior to reduce what is a pretty significant aviation sector global warming impact, in terms of global emissions, you can see pretty amazing outcomes. So that was just another example I wanted to share for how you can use a technology like AI to give you the information and analytics that you need in real time to make decisions that can actually help avoid the creation of global warming as well. So just wanted to share that example. And maybe just flipping over to you, Bob, as well. I mean, the Climate Trust has been running accelerator programs to try to kind of generate ideas and innovations like this for governments and businesses around the world. You're picking maybe specific decarbonization challenges within the sector. You're then trying to focus and bring the innovation ecosystem around that challenge. So I'm just, would love to hear from you. How does that work? And what have you learned in trying to run these types of accelerators?
Thanks, Antonia. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting opportunity space here. So, there's a huge amount of entrepreneurial energy, creativity in the world, and I think from a climate perspective, harnessing that and ensuring that that's focused on the most sort of relevant and important emissions problems is a key sort of factor that we need to deliver on to achieve the transition that we're all working towards. And these kind of accelerator programs can help to do that. Generally, what you would want to do with these kind of programs is identify, within a particular industry, a hard to abate aspect of operations. That's hard to abate means there's something that's causing emissions and it's a bit tricky to kind of reduce that. So an area, in short, where there's a big innovation opportunity. An example, we ran a program called, it's a bit of a mouthful, the Industrial Energy Efficiency Accelerator for DESNZ. And that covered a lot of different sectors. But there was an interesting data center application actually that came through from that. It was a team from Hull, and they were demonstrating and trialing and improving a cooling system that was 10 times more energy efficient than the conventional approaches. And you talked earlier about data centers and the kind of things that are driving emissions associated with data centers. So the IT load is obviously the biggest slice of the pie usually. but particularly with AI data centers, they run quite hot, and so cooling is particularly important. So being able to kind of optimize and improve the cooling side of things really helps emissions there. In terms of what makes these programs work, I think for early stage technologies, these types of government supported programs are quite helpful. I mean, famously, lots of technology that we use on a daily basis today originally came from sort of government funded blue sky research. But when we're thinking about sort of climate applications and the time frame within which we have to act, we find it's often helpful to partner directly with industry, with big corporates, and with investors as well, to really kind of crystallize for a particular sector, what are those challenges? What are the kind of boxes that a corporate corporate entity might need to tick in order to deploy a solution? And that might be around cost, it might be around operational considerations, and crystallize that solution, and then kind of go out to the market and to sort of see, who's out there who has innovative solutions that might be able to address this. What can really help, in particular, is if those corporates who are sort of pooling their requirements also sort of signal to companies, hey, if you have a solution out there that ticks those boxes, we'll buy it, right? And that, of course, then helps those companies raise investment because they've got a sort of a market that they're able to serve. So that sort of virtuous cycle and combination of different factors can really help accelerate the market maturity and the scaled deployment of these climate tech solutions. So I think it's really exciting, and I think getting that challenge definition correct is one of the key parts of the problem. That's a key principle of design thinking in general. Maybe just turning back to you and thinking again the topic of this conversation. What are those big unsolved challenges that you see out there where AI can probably play a big role in addressing them?
So we talked a lot about energy, of course, and so there's certainly a lot of opportunities still to tap into in terms of how AI itself can be deployed to help accelerate the energy transition. We talked a little bit about demand response already, but equally things like citing renewables. We built a tool called Solar API, which helps developers identify rooftop solar potential globally, as one example. So the energy sector is certainly one area where we see a significant opportunity to deploy AI to enable the sector to transition. I wanted to, though, flag another area. So one of the things that I find really interesting is that every day I feel like I'm seeing new applications and new interesting ways that AI is actually helping to tackle climate change. And I don't know about you, but when I have long drives with my kids, I like to play games with them, right? Ask questions like, what's the largest animal in the world? What's the smallest animal in the world? What's the deadliest animal in the world? And we don't use Google, but we actually try to come up with the answers ourselves before we check. So one example, I'm going to ask you, Bob, is like, what is the deadliest animal in the world? Do you know?
Human being.
So that was actually my first guess too. It turns out that humans are number 2, but the number 1 is mosquitoes, right? So mosquitoes are already the deadliest being in the world. They kill between 700,000 and a million people every year. And with warming temperatures, erratic rainfall, we are seeing an acceleration actually of mosquito-borne illnesses. And so this is where actually this week I learned about some interesting work that, within Google, there's so much happening, it's hard to keep track, that Google has been doing for a while. There's something called the Debug project. And this project is really about trying to target specific disease-carrying species of mosquitoes to help shift the mosquito populations to ones that are not actually able to bite and transmit these diseases. So essentially, they're using AI to help identify and sort between male and female mosquitoes. The female mosquitoes are the ones that bite and carry disease. Male mosquitoes with a particular bacteria don't. So when the males and the females actually, mate, the females will lay eggs, but they will not hatch. And so you see a reduction in the mosquito population over time. They're essentially using the AI to be able to sort sort the males from females, which apparently is quite difficult. They're also using robotics to help rear a large volume of these mosquitoes as well. And then as they release them, they're able to track those populations. And essentially what this does is by releasing these male mosquitoes into these ecosystems, over time, it reduces the overall population of disease-carrying mosquitoes. And what they've seen is that through trials in Singapore, for example, they've been able to achieve a greater than 90% reduction in the mosquito population, which has enabled a cutting of dengue cases by 65 to 80%. So for me, I found this to be a really fascinating example and almost a surprising example of how AI is being used in an area that I wouldn't have expected it, right? You know, who would necessarily think about AI and mosquitoes and trying to kind of manage those populations to ultimately help reduce disease in individuals. But these are the kinds of exciting things that are happening every day. Everything from, as I said, the energy system to really technological focused things to looking at how we manage disease-bearing mosquito populations to how are we tracking wildlife and managing kind of wildlife populations in national parks through camera tracking analysis. So I'm really excited about all of these different innovations. And as somebody who has worked on climate for my entire career, I think it's about time that we really apply these innovative solutions to this sector as we need to continue to see progress. So I'll leave it at that, but a huge thanks, Bob, for a great discussion.
Thanks, Antonia. That was really great. And yeah, we've covered the spectrum there from applications of AI to kind of mitigate emissions through to applications of AI to kind of cope with the climate impacts that we're already seeing play out today. So really fascinating. Thank you. I think I'm handing back to Tim now. And yeah, thanks again for the discussion.